Alright fam, quick question. Do any of you know that the father of Russian literature is actually of African descent?
Huh?
February 16th, time for more Black excellence during Black History Month. Alright, so today's subject is Mr. Alexander Pushkin. If you don't know, you're about to know. Alexander Pushkin was born in Moscow, Russia on June 6, 1799. And he is actually the great-grandson of the Cameroon-born general Abram Ganabal, who was the godson of the very first Russian emperor, Peter the Great. Throughout his life, Pushkin was a decent student who had a huge passion for poetry. He would then graduate high school in 1817 and afterwards would attend the Collegium of Foreign Affairs in St. Petersburg. Over the next 3 years, he would become associated with members of the radical movement that would be responsible for the Decembrist uprising in 1825, which was a plot to overthrow the Tsar Nicholas I. And although his writings were found amongst the conspirators, Alexander was actually exiled to northern Russia prior to the events, so he would escape punishment while the rest of the ringleaders and those involved would eventually be executed. A year later in 1826, he would be forgiven by Nicholas I, and that's when Alexander would actually go on an extraordinary period of creativity with his work. Over the next 5 years, he would go on a tear, including writing two of his most notable masterpieces, Eugene Onegin and Boris Godunov. Then, in 1831, he would go on to marry Natalia Goncharova, but their marriage would actually have some trouble, because 5 years later in 1836, a French military officer named Georges d'Anthès would try and pursue Natalia, which would justifiably enrage Alexander to the point where he would challenge him to a duel. Now, Alexander would retract this duel when George would go on to marry Natalia's sister. However, George would still try to pursue Natalia even after marrying her sister, which would still piss off Alexander even more. So, Alexander would once again go on to challenge George in a duel, and it would occur on January 27, 1837. However, during this duel, Alexander would be mortally wounded and would die 2 days later on January 29, 1837. All of Russia would mourn his passing, and almost instantaneously overnight, Pushkin would be hailed as the father of Russian literature. And even upon his death, Pushkin identified with his African heritage and would highlight it throughout several passages in his work. So with literature, books, and poetry being the passion for Alexander Pushkin, here's today's quote. "Salvation is certainly among the reasons I read. Stories have given me a place in which to lose myself. They have allowed me to remember. They have allowed me to forget. They have allowed me to imagine different endings and better possible worlds." Miss Roxanne Gay.